Hello classy people, this is Josh the Top Hat Gamer, and this week I'm reviewing Darkest Dungeon. In recent years there's been a surge in games that pride themselves on their high levels of difficulty, from games like the Dark Souls series to smaller roguelike titles. Darkest Dungeon is one such title, but just being hard doesn't necessarily make it good. Let's take a look and find out if Darkest Dungeon has more to offer than sheer challenge. Darkest Dungeon begins as you receive a letter from a relative informing you that you've inherited his mysterious estate. You come to learn that this relative of yours was conducting excavations beneath the estate in search of fame and fortune, but found only horror and madness, eventually taking his own life to escape the insanity. As the new owner of the estate, it's up to you to seal your relative's mistakes back inside the Darkest Dungeon, and bring honor back to your family's name. Darkest Dungeon isn't overbearing with its narrative, but there is plenty to sink your teeth into if you really want it. The premise is fairly simple, but there are a number of smaller subplots within the game that are conveyed via journal entries and narrations that make the world of Darkest Dungeon dreadfully unforgettable. Part of the game's nightmarish charm comes from the narration that communicates much of the lore. The narrator is damn near perfect, and each grandiose word is dripping with a gravitas that I've not seen in a game in some time. Without a doubt, Darkest Dungeon's narrator easily gives one of the best voice performances I've heard in a game, hands down. The music also fits the game's grave tone perfectly, with low strings and thumping percussion punctuating the various tense battles you'll take part in, and the oppressive nature of the game's locations and enemies are made all the more threatening thanks to the creepy ambient sounds and visceral sound effects that follow your every move. Accompanying the game's suitably dark sound design is a grim visual design that utilizes a somewhat angular, heavily contrasted hand-drawn art style that provides the game's cast of heroes and monsters plenty of personality while never looking overly cartoonish. The action on display is made to feel impactful thanks to some minimal but well implemented animations and camera effects, and as a result the game feels super satisfying to play. When it comes to actually playing Darkest Dungeon, the game delivers fairly deep, rewarding mechanics bundled together with a ruthless RNG system that dictates practically everything that occurs. At its core, Darkest Dungeon is a turn-based RPG and asks you to explore your estate's various randomly generated dungeons using a number of different heroes who fulfill certain roles and requirements. From melee-focused damage dealers to less offensive support heroes, there are almost endless possibilities when it comes to building your team of heroes. This is thanks in part to the sheer number of abilities on offer within each unique class, allowing certain characters to inhabit multiple roles. For example, you can utilize a highwayman as either a frontline duelist with the ability to inflict status effects, or you can leave him near the back of your party to deal solid ranged damage. How you build your party is also dependent on their physical position within the team. Certain skills can only be used in certain spots in your lineup, making the group's layout a big part of the game's strategy. Playing off of these location mechanics is the fact that some class abilities have the potential to switch the team structure around a bit. Not only that, but enemies often have the potential to move your heroes around too, meaning that you always need to be wary of your hero's position in the midst of battle. Outside of building your team and utilizing their skills, you still have to traverse the ever-treacherous dungeons, and though the side-scrolling style may make them seem rather harmless, danger is waiting around every corner. Whether that means deadly traps to ensnare your heroes or temptations to affect their sanity, evil is always lurking amidst the potential treasures, just waiting for you to disturb it. The dungeons are an incredibly dangerous place, and while you will sustain damage and even contract stat-lowering diseases during your time on the front lines, the threat of death isn't your biggest concern. After all, once a hero's HP hits 0, a death blow still needs to land in order to rid your party of the endangered hero permanently. It's the constant buildup of stress that presents Darkest Dungeon's greatest threat to your success. Your hero's sanity is constantly taking damage from moves that specifically target their stress meters, as well as the result of side effects from taking critical hits. And unlike death, completely filling your stress meter can't be undone until you leave the dungeon, and the resulting effects can be catastrophic. Reaching your mental breaking point can result in your hero becoming afflicted with a temporary status that will continue to affect their performance until you return to the estate, as well as negatively affecting the performance of their team members on top of that. If stubbornness prevails and you choose to push your heroes further, the buildup of stress could result in a life-threatening heart attack. That's not to say there's no defense against the stress-inducing horrors of Darkest Dungeon, and much like how you can recover health with certain characters, the same can be done to lower your ever-filling stress meters. Additionally, if you do manage to hit your mental breaking point, there's a slight chance that your hero might become virtuous instead of afflicted. Virtuous heroes are granted serious stat boosts, as well as the ability to randomly heal themselves or their companions' stress levels, but the odds of a character coming out of these situations on top is slim to say the least, thanks to the game's brutal RNG system. Practically everything in Darkest Dungeon is dictated by its behind-the-scenes random number generator, from dungeon layouts to critical hits and misses to whether your heroes become virtuous or afflicted. In fitting with the game's dark tone, most instances of RNG within the game are slanted against your favour, and to be honest, at times the game seems almost too unfair. Missing attack after attack, sustaining critical hit after critical hit, barely ever having heroes become virtuous. It's easy to get frustrated by Darkest Dungeon when even the most meticulous planning can't stop your entire team from being wiped out. Sometimes it's just bad luck. But then, it happens. You hit that much needed critical hit, a monstrous opponent misses a key attack, your hero becomes virtuous in the face of death and adversity. Whatever it is, eventually fortune favours you, and it feels so good. Does it excuse the often infuriating dice rolls that turn the best laid plans into ultimate failure? Not entirely, but the dizzying highs wouldn't feel quite so satisfying if you weren't facing insurmountable odds for the rest of the time, would they? For those that do find the game a bit too difficult, there are a number of options available to make the game at least a little more manageable, including the option to remove stress-induced heart attacks. I'm not exactly opposed to the brutality of Darkest Dungeon's dice rolls, but it doesn't exactly nail every part of its game design either. I have to say that the interface lets down what I would otherwise consider a near-perfect game, on consoles at least. If you're playing Darkest Dungeon on PC, then it's damn near perfect, but on PS4 and Vita, the UI is clunky and it takes a while to get used to. For example, on the screen where you assemble your team and go into your chosen dungeon, it is way too easy to accidentally send a team of rookies into a high difficulty dungeon simply because you weren't holding the correct trigger, or because the UI glitched out and moved your dungeon choice when you weren't looking at it. The interface is clearly made for mouse and keyboard, and it's a little disappointing to see that it hasn't been optimized at all for any other platform, especially considering it's my only real issue with the entire package. My UI gripes aside, I'm incredibly impressed by everything else Darkest Dungeon has to offer. Beyond every aspect of the gameplay I've mentioned so far, you have an upgradable base that offers the ability to recover heroes' overall health and stress levels, as well as upgrading their gear and skills, while also filtering in more potential heroes to replace the dead if you need to. On top of all that, there's a good handful of unique bosses to take on as well, and they'll keep you on your toes, as if you weren't already. For a game that seems relatively small at the outset, there is a surprising amount of depth to be found alongside the potential hours and hours worth of random dungeons to conquer. So Darkest Dungeon is hard, often unfairly so, but the concept of facing impossible odds is so intrinsically tied to the game's overall tone that it's hard to be all that critical of it. It also doesn't hurt that the game's core mechanics offer satisfying depth alongside Darkest Dungeon's unique and consistent overall presentation. The game could stand to have its UI improved, but aside from that, I genuinely adore this game, even if it had me frustrated more often than not. Darkest Dungeon gets the top at gamer rating of excellent. From its art style and sound design to its gameplay, Darkest Dungeon is a winner in my books. Its frustration-inducing RNG mechanics won't be for everyone, but for those looking for a challenge with a Lovecraftian flavour, Darkest Dungeon is a must-play. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the review informative. If you missed the last review on Recore, click the annotation. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go listen to Lovecraftian audiobooks narrated by Darkest Dungeon's narrator. It's a real thing. Go look it up.